A very warm greeting to you, my viewer out there. I'm delighted to have you join us again for this broadcast. I still remain Emmanuel Ogbinaka, an agricultural consultant, specifically in the area of soil science and land management. Once again, you are welcome. Please do subscribe to all our available platforms for more information and to also follow up what we represent in Silvawell Agro Real Estate Company. And we trust you to know that every information you need to know about all that it takes to cultivate the oil palm crop, which we have been discussing, and other things I've highlighted, you can get all of this information in any of our platforms. So do well to subscribe and get more detailed information. For this section, we are going to be discussing, like I did promise, the science of intercropping or cover cropping as it relates to the cultivation of oil palm. During the first 3 years, you remember I did mention that the latent period for the oil palm crop is about 3 to 4 years. So maximum 4 years, the oil palm is already producing. Within that 3 years period before the oil palm start producing, there is actually a productive aspect of agriculture that can also be brought in, and that is what we refer to as intercropping. So let me quickly make us understand what intercropping or cover cropping is all about. Intercropping is a system where a crop is grown in between another crop. So you have what I will call the primary crop, which is the tree crop, in this case now the oil palm, and then you have your secondary crops, which I'm going to give some few examples in the course of this broadcast, planted in between the primary crops. And then we talk about cover cropping. In cover cropping, we are dealing with a system whereby crops, especially creeping crops, which are in most cases legumes, are planted on the same land to provide basically shade to the soil, and this help to suppress weed to a large extent, can also help in controlling soil erosion. And another beautiful thing about this system is that the waste materials, decaying leaves and parts of these crops or plants could as well add nutrients to the soil. So that helps to replenish the soil nutrients. I refer to the cover cropping as life mulching. They are using live crops to provide a kind of mulching system to the soil. But most time, crops that are used for cover cropping may not be economical. What I mean is that most time those crops do not really yield beneficial products. Plants like mucuna, talks about plants like the cetrusima, plants like the puero, plants like the mimosa pudica, the calopo plants. All of these plants are creeping plants that help to provide cover to the soil surface, the surface of your plantation. And again, I said this helps to suppress weed, it helps to control erosion, and it helps to also replenish the soil nutrient. Now, although intercropping, which is my main emphasis, could also involve cover cropping, most crops that are used for the intercropping system of farming are usually and should be economical crops. Remember, I said that the agro real estate business is a kind of diversified form of investment that gives opportunity for multiple inflow of income. And so these signs of intercropping is also another avenue that can compensate the farmer within that latent period of 3 to 4 years before the oil palm plantation can start production. Therefore, taking this into consideration, one will be very careful to choose some crops that are economical, that can also produce yield and produce some profit to the farmer within this period. It is advised that crops to be chosen for this intercropping system are highly economical. Now, there's a principle, there's a science that guides intercropping. The principle of intercropping is that an early maturing crop is planted among the late maturing crop, and most time the late maturing crop are planted first before the early maturing crop. And also the early maturing crop that are used for intercropping purposes are all or most of the time harvested before the late maturing crop. So looking at the oil palm we are discussing, the oil palm is a late maturing crop. Like we said, it will take 3 to 4 years before production will start. And so within this period, you have other crops that can mature and be ready for harvest before that period of 3 years. And so those are some of the principles. It's a principle where early maturing crop is interplanted among the late maturing tree or plantation crop, in this case the oil palm. But it is worth noting rather the science or the principles or the laws that should guide the farmer in intercropping his oil palm plantation, because you're not just going to choose any crop and intercrop with the oil palm. There are principles that guide this practice, and I want to quickly share with you 4 basic science principles that guide the system of intercropping. Number 1 is that the secondary crops here are the crops you want to intercrop with the primary crop, which in this case is the oil palm. So principle number 1 is that the secondary crops should not in any way disturb the primary crop in their operations. So in choosing the crop for this system, you have a long-term goal in mind, that the major emphasis are on the oil palm, the tree crops. And so you wouldn't want to choose a crop that carrying out the operations that relate to that crop will have to disturb your permanent or your primary crops that have been established. Okay, and then principle number 2 is that your secondary crops to be intercropped with the oil palm should be less competitive with the primary crop. There are some crops that can be used. I'm going to give you some examples of crops that you can use for this purpose, because some crops are not ideal. Any crops that will unnecessarily compete with the primary crop, which is the oil palm, should be avoided, knowing full well that the long goal is the oil palm plantation. So the crop should be less competitive. Competitive for what? Competitive for nutrients, competitive for moisture, competitive for sunlight. Now when you talk about nutrient, you talk about moisture, there's competition. One thing that happens among crops is that there's always competition. There could be what we call interspecific competition, and there can be intraspecific competition. Now in this case, now we have different crops. We're talking about interspecific competition, and the nutrients required by these crops are obviously present in the soil. Now what is the science behind intercropping? The permanent crop you have cultivated, of course, have a root system that is deep into the soil. And so when you are choosing a crop to intercrop with the oil palm, you must be very careful to choose a crop that doesn't have a root system like that of the oil palm. Because if you now have 2 crops with the same root zone and root system, that's going to create unnecessary competition for nutrients, because the 2 tree crops have a kind of root system that is present in a particular zone of the soil that will make the nutrient available in that zone to be short reserved for your major crop or your primary crop. That will create unnecessary competition. So I'm saying principle number 2 is that the crop to be chosen for this purpose should be less competitive. Both for sunlight. There are some crops that grow vigorously. Within the shortest possible time, they are able to create shade and cover. You wouldn't want to choose such crops and intercrop such with the oil palm. It will create unnecessary competition for sunlight. So you will now have your secondary crops shading off your main crops, preventing them from the reach of your sunlight. Of course, we know that sunlight is key to the establishment and continuous growth and even the production of the oil palm. Principle number 3, or law that guides intercropping, is the fact that the secondary crop must be shade tolerant. Don't forget, we're also talking about making profit from the intercropping system. So the crop that should be chosen for that purpose should be a crop that is shade tolerant. What do I mean by that? Not all crops can do well under shade. You already have a tree crop, the oil palm, growing in that environment, and then obviously within first 1, 2, approaching the 3rd year, you see that the oil palm is already extensively bringing out the more leaves and creating more shade. Like I said in the first principle, the first science behind is that don't plant any crop that will disturb your primary crop. So you cannot begin to cut off or trim off unnecessarily the branches or the leaves of the oil palm, because the leaves is very essential for their growth and their production. And so you will not want to trim unnecessarily to favor your intercrop plant. So you must be able to choose crops that are shade tolerant, that will be able to survive and carry out their production within the little shade that have been provided by your primary crop. So that is a factor that must be considered if intercropping is to be practiced. And then the 4th principle behind the system of intercropping is that secondary crops should not be another perennial crops. You cannot be planting orange as intercrop. You cannot be planting pawpaw. You cannot be planting mango. You can't be planting another perennial crop. The oil palm is already a perennial crop. So any crop that must be chosen to be intercropped must either be an annual crop or a biennial crop. By that, crops that can grow, produce, and end their life cycle in less than 2 years. So the science behind intercropping is that only crops that are not perennial should be intercropped with the oil palm. Now, I haven't stated these principles that should guide you in making such vital decision. Let me now dwell briefly on some examples of crops that are suitable for this intercropping system that favors the oil palm. For example, you have your pineapple. Your oil palm can be intercropped with pineapple, with banana or plantain. Yes, those are not perennial crops, those are annuals and biennial crops. You can also intercrop your oil palm plantation with ginger. Ginger is also another shade-loving plant. Of course, the product of this crop I'm mentioning, they are still very much economical. They can also serve as profits to the farmer, though they will not give rise to undue competition with the major crop that you have planted. Crops like vegetables also, especially within the first year or second year of establishment, can also suit that purpose. So see, these are some of the examples of crops that you can choose for intercrop for the reasons that I've earlier stated. Let's now look at quickly the importance of intercropping. I believe that you've learned something behind choosing the right crop for this purpose, the system of intercropping. What is the importance of intercropping? Let's run through that. Quickly, the first I've been mentioning is additional source of income. For those people that we want to say, what will I be doing for the first 3 years before my oil palms start producing? Intercropping best answers that question. So you have crops that can, in the meantime, be generating some income to your hands to cushion the expenses you may have been incurring within that space of time before your oil palm will start production. So the very first benefit or importance of intercropping to the farmer is the additional source of income. Another importance is some of these plants. I measure some plants which may not really have economic values. Even the ones that have economic values, their vegetative portions can also serve as livestock forage. And that speaks of feed for livestock, especially for some of these farmers that may also have other businesses like livestock development and all of those things. Another importance for intercropping is the replenishment of soil nutrients. It's one of the ways to contribute to soil health. Of course, when we talk about soil health, again, that's another topic that we're going to take time to deal with. We are talking about soil that is highly fertile, and what brings about soil fertility has to do with the presence presence of organic matter, organic materials. And some of these crops that have been used as intercrop could provide some of these materials. And once these organic materials, these leaves, dead parts of plants are present in the soil, it gives the soil, or it keeps the soil active, because the beneficial microorganisms in the soil will have their food source, the organic materials, to engage with. And the process of them decomposing these organic materials, they are adding nutrients to this soil. That is why the intercropping is beautiful. So even after harvesting some of these crops, those crops can be again put into the soil, incorporated back into the soil, and this can provide food for the beneficial microorganisms, like I said, in the soil, create healthy soil, and then thereby leading to increased fertility of the soil, which can also help in the growth of your primary crop, which is the oil palm. Another importance of intercropping that I wish to mention is the fact that this crop can also help to prevent soil erosion. Especially some of these cover crops can help to prevent soil erosion. Even some of these intercropping systems can also help to prevent soil erosion. Another importance of intercropping, very beautiful importance. Let me mention here that one of the fear of farmers, most in cropping farming generally, is the fear of having to contend with weed. Of course, I've mentioned that the oil palm is highly resistant to weed. Speaking from personal experience, highly resistant, but that does not mean some other factors I'm going to mention, you don't have to remove the weeds. And so weed is a big problem. The science, the system of intercropping and cover cropping help to inhibit the growth of weeds. So the cover cropping or intercropping, we provide shade, because at that early period of your oil palm plantation, the oil palm have not established enough branches that will be adequate enough to create shade. Let me just mention here that even if you want to contend with wind, you will do that more at the early stage or stages of your oil palm development. There's a certain stage your oil palm plantation gets to that once shade is provided, the shade can help naturally to suppress weed. And so this is one of the beautiful things about intercropping for those who are scared of having to contend with weed on weekly or monthly basis. Your intercropping system can help suppress or inhibit the growth of weeds. And then the last importance of intercropping that I wish to talk about here is regulation of soil temperature and moisture. Like I said, that 1 year to 2 years of your establishment of your oil palm, they've not provided enough shade, and so there is still direct contact between the sun and the soil, because one of the beauty of mulching is it helps to limit the intensity of light reaching the soil, thereby keeping the soil healthy, because the beneficial organisms in the soil need some minimal temperature to carry out their activities. The intercropping system help to regulate the soil temperature and also help to regulate the soil moisture. If you want to demonstrate that, you'll discover that if you fill the soil under a shade and compare it with the temperature of soil in an open surface, you will agree with me that's not going to be the same temperature. And so the intercropping help to provide a system of naturally regulating soil temperature and regulating soil moisture. By that, it helps the soil not to quickly dry up. So the cover cropping provides a system where moisture is reserved in the soil for the growth of your crop. So this is a beautiful thing. And then regulating the soil temperature also helps to keep the soil healthy, as I've mentioned before, thereby giving the beneficial microbes in the soil a conducive environment to thrive in. So it's beautiful learning about this. So you're a farmer out there thinking of going into the oil palm plantation, and you are thinking about the control of weeds and thinking about how you're going to get return on expenses within that first 2-3 years of the establishment of oil palm. I'm suggesting to you, and we are telling you, that intercropping is a way to go. Not just that it will help to create a healthy environment and soil for your primary crop to grow, it will also compensate the farmer in all expenses incurred within that period of time. And I believe that when you are thinking of going for intercropping system, this little information will guide you on the right crop to choose based on the principle and the science that is supporting this system. So on this note, I want to end it here on this broadcast and look forward to you joining us again as we keep digging deep into everything that surrounds the establishment of your oil palm crop. Again, please do well to subscribe to the company or social media platform so that you can get more information. All of these things and other things that we are going to be learning in the course of this station, you can easily get when you subscribe. Thank you, and see you in our next broadcast.